Elizabeth's fighting spirit saw her through, and the next film would elevate her to superstardom once more.
Cleopatra marked a huge stage in Liz Taylor's career, personally and professionally.
Cleopatra was the biggest movie that Fox were going to make. That's 20th Century Fox. And they decided that I was going to play Cleopatra. And they were going to go ahead and make the movie with me.
Don't you love me? Don't you want Egypt? Don't you want the world?
So I did all these tests, and I thought I was going to get the part. And then the budget climbed and climbed and climbed. I have no idea why it climbed. I think they decided to make sets in England at Pinewood or something, and they cost a lot. So they told me, well, they didn't tell me. My agent told me, yeah, they're not going to use you. They're going to use Elizabeth.
Fox wanted Elizabeth Taylor to play Cleopatra. So they said, sure, that's great. She'll play the part. She wants $1 million for it.
It was unheard of. I think the most that actors ever got in those days was like 150,000, 250,000, maybe if you were Marlon Brando or Gregory Peck.
The $1 million deal made history. The studios even set up a press conference when the contract was signed. Elizabeth Taylor had become the highest paid star in the world.
She went on to film Cleopatra in London, which was madness in itself, because film set in Egypt and Rome, and they're filming in London. Where the hell are they going to get the weather from to start with? And the weather actually played an important part in what happened next, because she was flimsily dressed as Cleopatra in rather cold conditions at Pinewood Studios, and she contracted pneumonia. Very, very bad pneumonia. She had a tracheostomy, and indeed she nearly died.
Over a 3-week period, Elizabeth Taylor fought for her life while the eyes of the world looked on. Amongst the many news reports, one even prematurely announced her death.
My agent, Jay Cantor, called, and he said, Elizabeth has been taken very ill. She's been rushed to the hospital. She's not expected to live. So I want you to stay by the phone all day, because if she dies, you're going to have to take the night plane to London, and they're going to put you in her costumes and they're going to start shooting with you. I said, that's terrible. How awful. I don't want her to die. I mean, and I would just feel so dreadful. He said, look, honey, that's showbiz.
Of course, crowds collected outside the London clinic when it was known that Liz Taylor would soon be leaving. They waited hours to see her and to film the scene. And what an amazing scene it was when she was brought out in a wheelchair. Everyone knows the story of her very grave illness, and now there were so many well-wishers crowding round, it was an impossible job getting her to the roads.
Soon after her recovery, the next Oscars were announced. Again, Elizabeth was in the running for Best Actress, for a film she'd made the previous year, Butterfield 8.
There was a groundswell of public sympathy for her for having survived, which she thinks, and a lot of other people think, accounted for the fact that she absolutely walked away with the Oscar for Butterfield 8.
Things move to a climax as all eyes are on Yul Brynner and the Best Actress of the Year award.
Elizabeth Taylor.
Convalescing from her recent grave illness, Elizabeth Taylor receives a prolonged accolade from the audience. It's a popular choice, an Oscar for the beauty who is a winner after 4 successive tries.
In Butterfield 8, she plays an alcoholic prostitute, a role that Elizabeth was initially reluctant to take.
I think Elizabeth's performance in Butterfield 8 is one of the most honest portrayals of a woman's sexuality that had been on screen up until that time. She plays a young woman who enjoys having fun, who enjoys having sex, who has her life in her own hands. And I think audiences would have been quite surprised by such honesty from a picture, and because it's also what they perhaps suspected was about Elizabeth in real life as well.
Can I help you with anything? Elsewhere?
And after she got the Oscar for Butterfield 8, she went back to filming Cleopatra, which now, very sensibly, they moved to Rome. And the cast had changed. Originally, Peter Finch was supposed to play Mark Antony, but he'd had to drop out because of other commitments, and so Richard Burton came in.
You will kneel.
I will what?
On your knees.
You
dare ask the proconsul of the Roman Empire?
I asked it of Julius Caesar. I demand it of you.
With Richard Burton came the big, what Burton always referred to as le scandale, the big love affair. He was married to Sybil, she was married to Eddie Fisher, but I think once they got together on the stage of Cleopatra, pow.
When they met, she said she saw him for the first time, he had a terrible hangover and his hand was shaking, and she found this endearing. But then when they did their first kiss, the director had to say, "OK, it's time for lunch, can you stop that now?" They wouldn't stop the kiss.
It was obvious to everyone on the set that these two people were falling in love, that the chemistry between them was so thick, and they would disappear. They'd turn, where are they? They're not here to shoot this scene while they're off in the dressing room together.
I was very young when they were together, but I do remember seeing them together quite a lot. I think Burton felt that to have the most beautiful, glamorous woman in the world showering her passion on you was just completely intoxicating. He couldn't do anything about it. It hit him like a ton of bricks.
Beginning with tonight, you must never envy Caesar or anyone, anything again.
Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were the two most extraordinary people that I ever met. I think she found in him a match, and Richard loved being the one who was adored by the one and only Elizabeth.
It didn't take long for the press to get wind of the adulterous affair. Again, Elizabeth found herself at the center of a scandal.
Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton didn't apologize for falling in love, and that's what made them so different. And that's what made them so subversive in some ways, and it frightened a lot of people. The Vatican called them moral vagrants, and they were denounced in the halls of Congress and in Parliament. And it was this sense that they were flouting the very rules of society.
I remember the first picture that I saw was on the cover of an Italian magazine called Novella 2000, and it was Elizabeth and Richard lying on a yacht together. Apparently, they could not go anywhere without the paps there.
2 years after finishing Cleopatra, the pair finalized their divorces and married in March 1964.
Everybody was fascinated by them, and on their own they had been, but together there was just something. They were just this wonderful double act of a sort of moody and poetic, sort of literary Shakespearean actor and this tempestuous Hollywood goddess.
They became the template for the modern celebrity now. Their lives were no longer protected, and they had to have an entourage to protect them, and everything they did became public knowledge.
With Richard, Elizabeth was able to lead the life of a Hollywood superstar once more.
Elizabeth and Richard thought nothing about spending money. They were just living this outrageous lifestyle that everybody could see. Diamond rings, fur coats. Elizabeth loved living large. There's no denying that.
Like we'd be flying from one country to another country in midair, and all of a sudden we'd decide to fly to Venice for lunch. Things like that.
Original hijackers, then, very much.
During their 10-year marriage, the Burtons spent approximately $65 million on their champagne lifestyle. Richard showered Elizabeth with jewelry, and his first big purchase was the famously flawless Krupp diamond.
Elizabeth Taylor, here with no card, is the bride's godsister. She was wearing that ring.
Richard rang me up and said, Elizabeth's not very well, and you ought to go and see her. She would love it if you went and saw her. So I did. And I went into her room, and she wasn't looking very well. She was completely covered with bedclothes, and then a shy little hand came out and said, "Look, I never take it off." And there on her hand was this mighty rock diamond, which Richard had given her. I think it cost him $1 million pounds or $1 million, which in those days was simply frantic.
The pressures of a celebrity lifestyle pushed the Burtons into a period of heavy drinking and partying.
Elizabeth and Richard were both passionate people, and they loved to go out and have a drink and party, and Elizabeth wasn't that much of a drinker that I remember, but I think if you put the two together, they would drink more and party more together than if they were separated.
Elizabeth could be common as muck, yes, absolutely. Enormous vulgarity she commanded when she wanted to.
I enjoyed her company, and she was vivacious, and she was bubbly, and she told a good joke, and she swore a lot.
She used to say that Burton was, he was worth having a row with, because he gave us good, obviously, and he resorted to very colourful but also rather poetic language.
Burton and Taylor made 11 films together, but it was the 1966 film, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that best captured their powerful on-screen chemistry.
The way that they played Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which undoubtedly was her finest moment, maybe his, on the screen. It's about this warring couple, an academic and his wife, and they're drunk and they're always tearing each other apart.
In fact, he was sort of a flop. A great, big, fat flop.
Stop it, Mother.
I hope that was an empty bottle, George. You can't afford to waste good liquor. Not on your salary, not on an associate professor's salary.
To play the middle-aged Martha, Elizabeth used prosthetic makeup and gained nearly 2 stone in weight.
No one expected that Elizabeth Taylor would even get that part. Mike Nichols, the director, originally wanted Bette Davis for the part. He wanted an old, middle-aged, shrewish woman. And Elizabeth Taylor was still young and beautiful at this point. She was 32 when she got the part.
It was quite unheard of in those days for an actress as good-looking as she was to put on all that weight and play that blousy person who was supposed to be 20 years older than her. And I thought she was brilliant. She was terrific in that movie.
Stand it.
I cannot stand it.
You can stand it. You married me for it.
There was only one funny moment in that scene, and it wasn't too funny at the time, where Richard takes me and throws me up against the car. You can hear in the soundtrack a kind of thumping sound. That was my head against the back of the car.
Stop you!
Stop it! Stop it!
And I kept on going, and that was the take that Mike Nichols chose to use in the film.
Oh, boy. You really are having a field day, aren't you?
In a way, it's almost like an awful rehearsal for the relationship they had later when they were both drinking too much and they couldn't live together anymore.
After nearly 10 years of marriage, the superstar couple filed for divorce in 1974.
Liz Taylor was leaving town following her breakup with Richard Burton, and this is the mob scene that greeted her.
There is no question about it that they were still in love with each other. So it must have been a big wrench for them to have parted. And I think it was just the nature of their personalities that they couldn't live together.
But just 16 months later, Burton and Taylor were back together. They remarried, this time in Botswana.
They've been invited to a kind of second honeymoon, a tour of this splendid game reserve, and they're seeing it in the best way of all, on a helicopter safari.
By the second marriage, it really became where he had a drinking problem. Elizabeth really wasn't into the drinking very much, because Elizabeth was also a mother and had children, and she was a very good mother, and I just don't think she wanted to live with that. So they did part, but I think they always kept in touch and they always loved each other.
The reconciliation only lasted 8 months. The love affair of the century ended in divorce for the second time.
By the mid-1970s, Elizabeth wasn't really sure where she belonged anymore. She certainly wasn't making movies in the same way that she had been. Burton was gone, and there was a kind of a void. It was kind of a big question mark. Where do I go from here?
Elizabeth thought she'd found the answer in Washington when she married her 6th husband, the very respectable Republican politician, John Warner.
I've been campaigning for 18 months now.
And now you're just going out to face the crowd.
She really enjoyed the campaign trail. There was getting out meeting people, and she was wildly popular. People came to see Warner really to see Elizabeth Taylor.
Senator Warner would be in Washington most of the time, and Elizabeth would be in a house in Virginia, which she didn't grow up there. She didn't know many people there.
And she found herself sitting around their house in Georgetown, eating chili all day, and sweets and candies and cakes, and drinking too much.
Elizabeth Taylor always claimed that the marriage was where her weight problems really started, all those political lunches, whining and dining members of the Senate.
She was the senator's wife, which I think she was quite bored with. That's when she put on a lot of weight. She put on about 50 pounds.
Snake-eyed son of a bitch, Marty Fenn!
A year later, Elizabeth had slimmed down for what would be her final film, an Agatha Christie thriller called The Mirror Cracked. She was reunited with her old friend Rock Hudson and, with some irony, played the part of an aging movie queen.
Neither of them with you.
Lola Brewster, actress. If she's read the script, I'd see a blister on her finger.
Getting his first break was an unknown Irish actor.
The Mirror Cracked was my debut in movies. It just happened to be with Liz Taylor. I think I was 25. I was fresh out of drama school. My agent called me up one day. He said, I got you 2 jobs. One's called The Mirror Cracked. You got to show up Monday morning at the studio. So for me, I started my cinematic career with Liz Taylor. Doesn't get better than that, really.
How I've longed for you, to take you in my arms and clasp you to my bosom.
I had a great day. I had a wonderful time in her company and on the movie, and I have a photograph in my office at home, clasped to her bosom.
Jason, will you get that creep out of my eye line?
Cut.
Back in Washington, cracks were starting to appear in her marriage to John Warner.
He would be in Washington most of the time, and I think Elizabeth needed somebody that was companions, that was exciting, that would be her lover, that she could be with a lot, not somebody that was away most of the time.
She was the least likely Washington wife. She was not a Washington wife.
After divorcing Warner, Elizabeth courageously acknowledged her addictions.
I was a mess. And I admitted to myself that I was an alcoholic and I had a problem with prescription pills. And in order to survive, in order to live, I had to change that. And I wanted to live and be a whole, complete human being.
Elizabeth was the first Hollywood star to be treated at the now famous Betty Ford Rehab Clinic.
When she did go to the Betty Ford Clinic, just like everything else in her life, she wasn't going to pretend or hide or make up stories to cover it up. She also wasn't going to apologize for it. She'd never been one to apologize for anything. She said, hey, I've got a problem. I'm going in to take care of it.
Refreshed from rehab, Elizabeth needed a new, exciting challenge. So at the age of 55, the actress became the first star to launch a range of signature perfumes.
These have always brought me luck.
I'll bet.
White Diamonds, the intriguing fragrance from Elizabeth Taylor.
Elizabeth was extremely involved with her perfumes. Like everything else that was important to her in her life, she was extremely hands-on about it. I think she'd always wanted to design a scent. She'd talked about it for a long time because she was someone who loved perfume, always wore perfume, even for herself at home. It was part of who she was.
John Dryden wrote, "Where passion rules, how weak does reason prove?" You'll see.
Elizabeth Taylor's passion.
Her fragrance empire is incredibly successful. To date, it's $1 billion industry. It continues to be the top seller for Elizabeth Arden and is consistently one of the top sellers of all fragrances.
In the 1980s, Elizabeth's business empire flourished. But her success would be tainted by personal tragedy.
The actor Richard Burton has died in Switzerland at the age of 58. He suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at his home near Geneva and died later in hospital.
Their relationship, which had started like a great coup de foudre, a flash of lightning, continued flashing, burning, searing, illuminating, right through their relationship until Rich died.
Miss Taylor flew to Switzerland for what was supposed to be a private visit, just to have a few quiet moments by her former husband's grave in the churchyard at Celigny. But the foreign press were waiting.
No flash. No flash. Can't you just back off? Give her 5 minutes.
The appeals went unheeded, and Miss Taylor then decided to give up.
Just a year later, Elizabeth suffered another blow. It triggered one of the most significant turning points in her life.
Within the past half hour, we've heard that the film star Rock Hudson has died at his home in California. He was 59. It had been learned just over 3 months ago that Mr. Hudson had been suffering from the disease AIDS.
Elizabeth Taylor became involved with AIDS first through, of course, her friend Rock Hudson, and when he got sick and died, I think she was obviously devastated. I think there's no question that Rock Hudson's illness and death is what got Elizabeth Taylor involved. They were extremely close friends.
I think the commitment to HIV totally gave Elizabeth a completely new focus in her life. She'd gotten bored with making movies. I think she wasn't that interested in it anymore. I think she wasn't that interested in having to make her living from the way she looked. She realized that there was a useful part to fame, that she could actually use it in a way that would, you know, contribute to really cultural dynamic change. And that made her feel good about being famous, which had not been such a big deal to her before.
All we can do at this point is help our friends who have AIDS. And the only way we can do that is by doing what you're doing, by giving of support, money, and love.
She, I think, was courageous in standing up there and giving a face to this insidious, disgusting disease at a time where people were being banished and shamed by society. She had the balls to say, look at this. This is what's happening to these poor people's lives, and pay attention.
She took the risk of this disease, which nobody would talk about and nobody wanted to hear about, and stood up and said, I'm talking about it. You gonna ignore me? What are you gonna say to me? You gonna ignore me? I don't think so.
Is this something that we can bear? No. The AIDS crisis is not over.
She did this press conference, and she was asked specifically about Bush Sr.'s HIV policies, and she just sort of said, I don't even think President Bush knows how to spell AIDS, and made the front page of the newspapers back in New York and all this. And when you worked with her for a long time, you sort of forgot how famous she was, but suddenly you'd sort of be reminded of it, sort of when she said something like that, and it was reported everywhere, and it really, really changed the way people viewed how the US was treating HIV.
Let's support the programs that work, whatever the cost.
She was a very kind woman. I mean, that was the thing that's often overlooked. I mean, I suppose her charity work indicates that she was a very kind woman, but she was personally kind to people, as I had reason to know.
She was stubborn, and she was dedicated, and she really put her whole heart into saving people's lives. But she fought battles that were incredible. You know, and she changed history. She really did.
Tonight, you wonderful people have raised in excess of over $1 million.
She didn't have to do any of this. She was a millionaire, she was a movie star, she had a wonderful life in Bel Air. Yes, Rock Hudson got her going, but why did she continue? I think because she was the real deal. I mean, she really, truly cared about this.
There'd be many people that would not be alive today if it was not for Elizabeth Taylor.
Elizabeth's humanitarian work was recognized all over the world. In England, the Queen made her a Dame of the British Empire.
Dame Elizabeth Taylor,
for services to acting and to charity.
And Hollywood paid tribute with an honorary Oscar in 1993.
Even though Elizabeth adored getting her first 2 Oscars, I think it was the 3rd Oscar, the one for her humanitarian work, that really meant the most to her, because that was really how she always said she wanted her legacy to be remembered.
While Elizabeth was tirelessly campaigning, her health was deteriorating. In 1988, she was back at the Betty Ford Clinic with a renewed addiction to painkillers. But during recovery, she fell in love.
The actress Elizabeth Taylor has married for the 8th time to a California builder, Larry Fortensky, who's 20 years her junior. The wedding was held at the secluded ranch of the pop star Michael Jackson. The cameras did get a glimpse, first of the guests around the purpose-built summer house, and finally the couple themselves and the bride's $30,000 gown. Miss Taylor said, "I thought I'd try it once more before I die."
Elizabeth sold her exclusive wedding pictures for $3 million in order to set up the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation.
This check arrived at her house, paid to the order of Elizabeth Taylor, $3 million. And she decided that she was going to go down to the bank herself to personally deposit that check and open the account for her foundation. So she got dressed and she called her driver and she got in the car and she drove down the hill from Bel Air and went to the bank in Beverly Hills. And she told me, she said, "And I walked in the bank and I looked around and I realized, David, I had never been in a bank before in my entire life. Can you imagine that?" And it's like, well, yeah, I can imagine that. You're Elizabeth Taylor. Why on earth would you ever have to go to a bank?
In 1996, her 8th and final marriage came to an end. Her health also continued to decline. She then endured 2 hip operations and brain surgery to remove a benign tumor. But Elizabeth courageously continued to raise millions of dollars for her AIDS Foundation.
Elizabeth had lots of health problems, as everybody knows, and it did impact her AIDS work. There were times when she had to cancel events because of poor health, and we would scramble to get a substitute. But there were times when she literally got out of a sick bed.
I have done this every year for 30 years, and it's tradition.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dame Elizabeth Taylor.
In 2010, Elizabeth came to Britain for a special event at Buckingham Palace.
She'd flown over with her medicals and people from Los Angeles to be there to see a new head of Richard, which was unveiled on that occasion.
Prince Charles comes in and is introduced to us, and then, of course, late, making her entrance through Queen Elizabeth's back passages, Elizabeth is wheeled into the room, and as if she is the royalty in the room. She's wheeled in front of the bust of Richard, and she looked at it and started crying. And it was terribly, terribly moving.
I think deep down in Elizabeth's heart was a very special flame.